That's good. There should be lots of comments, lots of participation. Thank you all for coming. Perhaps you can all just write what time it is in your country, and let's see who's got the earliest time, who's got the latest. 5 o'clock, 10 o'clock, late at night, 11 p.m. for one person. A few people later, a few people earlier. 11 p.m. seems to be the latest we've got. 3 p.m. in the afternoon most places. Thank you all for coming. It's 9 o'clock in England. It'll soon be my bedtime, but good of you all to stay up. Midnight in Russia. Wow. Okay, let's get cracking. In the next hour, we are going to look at critical thinking, but particularly critical thinking skills for advanced learners. I've done previous webinars on critical thinking. Some of you might have come before. We've looked at definitions of critical thinking. I've looked at critical thinking for lower level learners. But in this session, we're going to focus on advanced learners in particular. Basically, there are 3 parts to the presentation. The first 2 are quite short. I'm going to define critical thinking in the context of the ELT classroom. So I'm going to give you my definition of what critical thinking is. People have different definitions. You will have your own idea of what critical thinking is, but I'm going to define it and put it into context so we know what we're referring to. The second part of the presentation, again quite brief. I'm going to contrast the main features of critical thinking at lower levels with those at higher levels, so we can see the relationship between learners at beginner to pre-intermediate level and learners at intermediate to advanced level. Okay. And then the third part, which is the main part of this webinar, is going to be practical. I'm going to suggest some practical ideas for developing what I think are key critical thinking skills for advanced learners. And we're going to try some of the activities, and I'm going to get you participating a bit more in that session. We'll stop for a few questions about a third of the way in, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. Let's get going. First of all, with a quick definition of what I think critical thinking is. People are still coming in the room, but let's get going. Okay, critical thinking. When we talk about thinking, lots of you will be familiar with the idea that we talk about lower order thinking and we talk about higher order thinking. And we can talk about those as if they're on a kind of a scale. So you see my scale here. The idea is that we can move our students from thinking at one level and get them thinking at a higher level. This originates from the work to some extent of Bloom's taxonomy and the idea of different levels of thinking. But since Bloom, we've moved on to the idea that rather than have 6 levels of thinking and a hierarchy, thinking works as a kind of a continuum. And we can break it down into 3 main categories. There's basic comprehension. So when we teach students an item of vocabulary or some grammar, we then check that they understand it. So basic comprehension is about remembering and understanding and then applying. Right at the top, at higher order thinking, is creative thinking. We ask students to create things. We ask them to produce something new and original with the language they have and the knowledge they have. Maybe they give a presentation, maybe they write a story, something creative. And in between that is critical thinking, where we ask students to analyze and evaluate. And quite often in lessons, we spend a lot of time dealing with basic comprehension and we get students to think creatively, but perhaps we spend a little less time asking students to think slightly more deeply and to get them analyzing and evaluating. If you walk into a classroom and you were looking for critical thinking taking place or different levels of thinking, you can often identify it by the type of exercise that the teacher is using. For example, for basic comprehension tasks, you might see a teacher giving students things like fill the blank exercises, true-false questions, matching activities. Good exercises, but they're just checking students' understanding of the language and getting them to apply it in quite a basic kind of way. If the teacher was developing critical thinking, we would probably see more exercises where the teacher is getting students to analyze a text, maybe a reading text, or they're analyzing sentences. Maybe they're inferring meaning from a text, from a reading or a listening, or we're asking them to discover the meaning to something, or evaluate the author's opinion, for example, or evaluate the opinion of their partner in a discussion, perhaps. So it's those kinds of activities. With creative thinking, we get students to give presentations, write essays, perhaps make videos, those kinds of things. And they tend to reflect these different levels of thinking. So for me, you can't talk about critical thinking without understanding its relationship to basic comprehension and also to creative thinking. Okay? People are still coming. You're okay. You're welcome to join us, Marco. If you just have to catch up. So that's my definition of critical thinking. Let's look at this in practice. Okay? First of all, critical thinking with lower level learners. Here's a lesson from an elementary course book. It's from Life Elementary, and it's looking at the topic of food. And I'm going to use this with elementary students. Let's just analyze two of the exercises from this spread. Here we've got basic comprehension, and if we look at this exercise 1, it's basically matching words to pictures. And all we're doing is checking students can remember and understand the words for food. Yeah, so it's a basic comprehension task. And rather, it's Life Elementary, published by National Geographic Learning. Okay. In exercise 2, remembering this is an elementary book, we get students to think about what they like and don't like, what they eat, what they don't often eat. So they're starting to analyze the foods and think about them a bit more critically. It's not really full-blown critical thinking, but it's making them think a little bit with higher order thinking. And that would be typical of the sorts of exercises that you'd see with elementary students. Let's contrast this with material for higher level students. Let's look at a lesson from Life Advanced. The topic in this advanced book is The Enigma of Beauty, and it's looking at the fact that different cultures define beauty in different ways. So what I find beautiful, you might find beauty in something different, okay, according to perhaps our culture or our perspective on life. So compare that with the elementary lesson on food. Already the topic and the context is much more complex for the advanced students because they have a higher level of English. Let's take one of the exercises from this page and just look at it in contrast to lower and higher order thinking. So this is exercise 2 from the book, and what the writer has done here is asked the students to look at 4 statements about beauty and to think whether those statements are true or not. So we're asking the students, what do you think about this topic? Well, these are quite difficult sentences. These are difficult to talk about in your first language, not just in your second language, in English. They're quite, you have to think quite deeply about them. So there's some critical thinking going on. And then the students have to go back to the article about beauty and find out the author's view. So there's an element of comprehension work going on there. So what you see here with advanced learners is that the exercise combines higher order thinking and lower order thinking kind of both at the same time. With elementary students, we tend to separate them because the students don't have the language level, they're dealing with language, and so they need things much more scaffolded. With the advanced students, we can challenge them much more with the exercise design. Okay? So let's just sum up the definition and what this means in terms of level. With beginner to pre-intermediate students, we can use topics and context which are concrete and known. So we can have topics like sport, food, free time activities, those kinds of topics. With intermediate to advanced, topics and context can be much more abstract. We can use more authentic texts. We can introduce topics that the students don't know much about, so that they are talking about topics which they really have to think about more deeply, and they have to learn something new about the subject. Generally, in lower level classes, there's a lower percentage of critical thinking tasks. We can still include critical thinking, but we spend a lot more time on lower order thinking and basic comprehension tasks. It's logical. With advanced students, there's a higher percentage of critical thinking and creative thinking because they have the language to cope with that. Exercises, I've just said, exercises with lower level material tend to separate levels of thinking. So we'll have an exercise where it's about basic comprehension, and then we have another exercise which is developing critical thinking. But with advanced learners, we can integrate levels of thinking, and they can be working both in higher order and lower order thinking almost simultaneously. The two things are working in parallel with some exercises. Finally, at lower levels, the student's much more dependent on the teacher. The teacher, for example, will generally ask the questions. If we give students a reading text, the teacher will write the comprehension questions. Or if we teach grammar, quite often the teacher teaches the rule. With more advanced students, they're more dependent on the learner. We can develop more learner autonomy, and students can discover rules rather than be told rules, or they can look at a reading text and come to their own conclusions. Okay? So that was the definition, and that was just then contrasting lower and advanced levels. Now, before I go to the next part of the webinar, which is much more looking at advanced students and the skills they need and some practical activities, are there any quick questions, or does anybody want anything clarifying before we move on? I'm just going to have a mouthful of water. Elizabeth, questions about lower levels. I did a webinar a few months ago with National Geographic Learning. If you go to the InFocus site, there's a recording of that webinar, and it's all about critical thinking with lower levels. I can't answer that question now because it's too big, but go and watch the webinar, okay? Integrating levels of thinking, what I meant was that in one exercise we might ask students to use their critical thinking and then, for example, go back to a text and look for the author's view on something. So we're combining critical thinking with basic comprehension skills at the same time, and with advanced levels they can cope with both of things going on at the same time. Topics as suggested to advance, Pamela. If you look in the advanced levels of books like Life, we do all sorts of topics, and quite often the texts are taken from authentic sources. So it might be things you come across in magazines, from newspapers. National Geographic is a really good source of interesting articles. Quite often it's about bringing things into class that students wouldn't normally read, but have some intrinsic interest. If you take a look again at the InFocused website with National Geographic, you'll find more ideas for text. Yes, TED Talks as well would work well with students, particularly advanced level students. Okay, so that was a quick quick recap of definitions and where we are in terms of advanced student. Let's get talking about the advanced learner. In terms of critical thinking, let's think about what are the key skills for our advanced learners. The first key skill for me are questioning skills. When I bring in a reading text or a listening text into class, I want my advanced students to ask the questions. I want them to pick up a reading text and think, well, what's going on here? What is the author saying? Why is the author saying it like this? Or if I'm listening to a TED Talk, I want to know more about the TED Talk speaker or what their perspective is. So instead of me, the teacher, always asking or writing the questions, and teachers spend a lot of time doing that kind of thing, I want the student to come in and start asking the questions. Yes, Karen, there's a little bit of critical literacy going on here. Yeah. The second key skill for me is that students, particularly advanced students, develop the ability to summarize what they've read or what they've listened to. Now, summarizing skills are particularly challenging even in your own language. I find it difficult to do sometimes. It's even harder, obviously, in your second language, in English. But there are ways in which we can help students develop summarizing skills and report back on what they've read about. Yes, getting to the heart of the matter, Uma, is a nice definition of summarizing, but there's a lot of analyzing and evaluating that takes place. I also want my advanced learners to comment and discuss, and if I've brought in an interesting topic to the lesson, I want them to have an opinion. Now, fortunately, lots of my advanced learners have strong opinions, but I still need to help them express their views in a certain kind of way. And sometimes I need them to use discussion language that's more subtle, that's more sophisticated. So I need to help them with that. For homework, I often set out advanced students research tasks. I want them to find out more about the topic. And what's wonderful now with the internet and so on is that I can bring in a reading to class, we can read about a topic, and then I can say to the students, for homework, can you go off and do some more research? So quite often the research happens as part of as a homework task, but the wonderful thing with advanced learners is you can ask them to do that kind of task. And the fifth skill is developing the student's own critical reflection skills. By this I mean that they might give a presentation, they might write an essay, they might do some research and so on. And then I want them to reflect on their own work and say, well, have I been successful? Now, normally, teachers give feedback. We tell students, yes, you've made a mistake, or this was good, or this wasn't so good. But with advanced learners, I also want them to develop the skills to be able to self-assess their own work and also peer evaluate each other's work. And we kind of need to develop that skill and build it into our lessons. So those are 5 key skills, I think, for advanced learners, and they're skills that advanced learners are capable of because they obviously have the language skills. What we're going to do now is look at each skill, and I'm going to suggest some practical ways in which we can help the advanced learners, okay? And we're going to try out a few activities. Okay. So first of all, questioning. What's going on here? I said that with lower levels, we often write the comprehension questions, or the teacher asks the questions. And I want my advanced students to ask questions. So if I bring in a reading text or a listening text, for example, a TED Talk, I need to train my students to automatically start to ask questions. And the types of questions I want them to ask are, what do I already know about the topic? So if they're about to read a text or listen to something, I want them to subconsciously think about, well, what do I already know about this? Do I have opinions on it? Have I read something before about it? I also want them to think about who wrote it, or if it's a listening, who's saying it, and how will this affect their opinion. For example, if it's a speaker, who is the speaker and do they have a certain perspective? Are they going to try and convince me of something, and so will they use language in a certain kind of way? Quite often, if an author or a speaker gives an argument, I want to know what evidence they're providing for that. So I'm going to look for supporting evidence, and I want advanced students to look for that evidence. So, Bianca, you're right, it could be quotations, it could be references to sources, it could be research they've done, maybe they've done surveys or something, but I'm looking for that kind of evidence. And I'm looking for the kinds of sources that they're providing to support their evidence. This is particularly important if you're teaching advanced learners who are going to go on to university and do their studies in English. Academic English, it's particularly helpful for, but also English for work. They're useful skills. And then students need to look, well, do I agree with the conclusion of the author or the presenter? Having read all of this, what do I think about it? And often we write the questions for the students, but we want advanced students are capable of just coming to those conclusions themselves and then sharing them with the class and giving their own opinion. And then we're really starting to develop their critical thinking. Anthony, yeah, good comment. Spotting author bias. I mean, that's linked to evidence, sources, what's the author's perspective, the whole fake news issue that Simon's just mentioned all comes into this, particularly with text taken from the internet. It's particularly relevant. And finally, I want the students to start thinking about where can I find out more about the topic. If I've brought a reading into class, for example, I want them to think about where can I find out more about it, and that links with research skills that's coming later. Now, I said it's important for advanced students to develop questioning skills, but it's not enough to say to the students, you need to think critically, or you need to ask questions. It's helpful if I can use an exercise to develop their mindset, okay? Here's a little exercise you can do with your students. Earlier, I showed you a reading text called The Enigma of Beauty, and the topic was how beauty, our idea of beauty, changes according to the culture we're from, okay? I'm going to show you a statement about beauty, and don't write anything, but just think to yourself, what's my opinion of this statement? Do I agree? Do I disagree? What do I think of it? Okay, there's the statement. You don't have to write anything, just think for 10 or 20 seconds. Okay, now Emily's going to share a poll with you, and you've got 6 statements there. Before you answer, read all the statements. Be careful, be careful. Read all the statements and then click the one that best reflects your reaction to the statement about beauty. Okay? It's a little critical mindset exercise. Bit late in the day for it, but see what you think. Just click the reaction that you had. We've got over 200 people in the room, so nearly half of you have answered so far. Some of you are thinking critically about it before answering the poll. Okay, I think we've got most of them, Emily. So most of you are opting for I agree it's true. Um, and some people have had enough. So let's look now. I'm going to show you what the answers say about you in terms of critical thinking. Do not take it personally. It's only an exercise, okay? But here are how you could interpret the answers, okay? So just have a look through. And you'll see that with answers E and F in particular, what I'm trying to say to students is, yes, I want you to have opinions. You can agree or disagree, but I also want you to perhaps go and look for more information before giving a final opinion. And what this exercise is doing is raising their awareness of what I want as a teacher when I say I want you to think more critically. I'm saying to you, have opinions and find the evidence that will support those opinions, okay? So it's just raising their awareness of the importance of questioning skills. It's particularly good for English for academic purposes students, university students, but it's a nice exercise if you're preparing students to write argumentative essays or you want students to have debates and discussions. It encourages them to think about why they have their opinions and how they're going to support their opinions, okay? It also just defines what we mean by a critical mindset or being a critical thinker, okay? It's a slightly fun, gamey type of exercise, but it's a very effective way of raising their awareness. Okay. So once I've got their questioning skills going, I might ask them to read a text or listen to a lecture, and then I want students to report back. And what often happens in lessons is we set comprehension questions, and then students just give me the answers and they tell me a word or they read out a sentence. But with summarizing, it's much more demanding for advanced students because you're getting them to decide what is important information. There's a couple of exercises you can do to get students familiar and to develop this skill, okay? Let's imagine that we've been reading a text about healthy eating, okay? And I'm going to take a paragraph from that reading text and I'm going to say to students, I want you to delete about 50% of the words in the paragraph but keep the same meaning. So this is a good starting point for summary skills. So let's look at the first sentence. The first sentence here says people usually think that in order to be healthy you need to eat certain foods, a balance of fruit, meat, vegetables, bread, etc. Which words, if we deleted 50% of that sentence, which words can we delete without losing the main meaning? Just type them in. Usually, okay, usually you could get rid of. You could say people think to be healthy, so you can cut that in order. People think to be healthy, you need to eat certain foods. Or you could say you need to eat a balance of fruit, meat and vegetables, and you could cut to eat certain foods. But you get the idea. You're basically deleting half the sentence and shortening it. So you're introducing the idea of analyzing and evaluating what is the main sense of the sentence. What I do with students is I give them the whole paragraph, they have a go at deleting all the words, and then I give them an example answer of what I'm looking for. So here's my suggested answer. And there you can see I've deleted a load of words, but still tried to keep the main sense of the paragraph. And then I could probably say to the students, now can you delete another 25%, until by the end of the exercise they get the absolute main idea of what the author's saying. And that's somehow much more manageable for our learners, and it's introducing the idea of what summarizing is really about. Okay? Remember, this is a difficult skill even in your own language, so we have to work slowly with students to get them. It's no good saying go and summarize a reading text if you haven't introduced how to actually do it. As Jessica's just said, it's challenging. Yes, it's difficult. But I think this is quite a helpful step. The other thing you're going to do if you introduce the topic of summarizing is to take something familiar to the students and ask them to summarize it. Okay? Now I'm going to introduce an activity to you that's kind of fun to do with students as an introductory activity to summarizing skills. I assume everybody here has read or heard about the writer Ernest Hemingway. Some of you might have read Ernest Hemingway, some of you have probably heard of Ernest Hemingway. He's very famous because he writes in a very succinct, direct way. He was famous as his own editor. He used to go through and delete a lot of his writing until he got absolutely, there's short sentences, Bianca. Shortest ever fictional story. Jenny's done this exercise. So, Hemingway was famous for his 6-word story. This is Hemingway's shortest ever story. For sale, baby shoes never worn. Okay? This story became so famous that actually there's a website called sixwordstories.net where people write their own 6-word novels and you can go and read them. And it's a very fun, creative task to do with students because it gets them to think in very kind of quick, short ways. But I like to do a bit like haiku, The Lord touched the water, it blushed. Very nice, Uma. Okay. You could do this in reverse, and this is more of a critical thinking task where you get students to summarize a story that they know in 6 words. So you choose a famous story and you ask students to summarize it in 6 words. This story works very well. Has everybody in the room either read this story or seen the film, or they roughly know what Harry Potter is about? Lots of people saying yes. Neither read it or seen it. Okay, Jasmine, you're just going to have to play on. Most people have read it. Some people have read it multiple times. Okay. Apologies, if you haven't read it, you're just going to have to observe. Okay? Here's the exercise. You say to students, I want you to summarize the story of Harry Potter in 6 words. So let's try it. Let's see if any of you can write summarize the story of Harry Potter in using only 6 words. Let's try it in the chat room now. Kid magician and friends face evil. Very nice, Otoro. Young boy finds stone, saves day. Fantastic. Harry on the broom against evil. In a nutshell, I did not read it. Okay, that wasn't a summary, Maria. Okay. No family, new friends become magician. Magic boy who lived and shone. Any others? Wizard boy fights Dark Lord yearly. That's nice. I like that, yeah. Boy goes to school, learns magic. Potter magician, great one. Okay, lots of nice summaries. Very good. Young boy with power and very brave. Orphan wizard beats. Off we go. Lots of them, lots of them. Lots of readers of Harry Potter. You get the idea. Here's my 6-word story. You can compare. Boy wizard beats Voldemort 7 times. That's a spoiler alert. If you've never read Harry Potter, I've just told you what the whole plot. Sorry about that. Spoiler, exactly, Anna. Yeah, and people are still writing the 6-word summaries. Okay, but you get the idea. It's a nice way to introduce summary writing. you take something familiar to the students and they work it that way. If you use graded readers with students, it's a nice exercise as well, because they can read the reader and then they try to summarize it in 6 words. But you really have to think critically about this. You really have to kind of analyze it and evaluate and think, what are the key points of this story? Karen, thank you. Your answer was way better. Well, I had more time to think about it, to be honest. Okay. But it's a really useful exercise. Now, I met a teacher recently who does something similar, and I hadn't done this, but I thought it was a really nice idea, so I'm going to tell you about it. This teacher did a similar exercise based on something that happens on Twitter. You know that in Twitter it used to be 140 characters when you write something in Twitter. I think it's 200 now, but it was 140. There was a group of people on Twitter who started to post summaries of famous books in 140 characters. So you could do the same exercise based around the idea of Twitter. I thought I'll show you how this works. So this comes from, you can look at the link from the Telegraph, but it's taking great works of literature and shortens them into tweets. So for example, somebody on Twitter might summarize the story, and you could ask students to do the same thing. So look at the first one. What do you think the piece of literature is in number 1? Any readers of English literature out there? James Joyce, Man Walks Around Dublin. Correct, Jasmine. 1 point to Jasmine. It was Ulysses. Next one. Charles Dickens, Orphan gives pounds by secret folly, thinks it's Miss Havisham. Oliver is not correct, Jenny. Great Expectations is correct, Jasmine. Okay. J.D. Salinger, Rich Kids, Everyone is Fake Except for His Little Sister, has Breakdown. Anybody know the title? Catcher in the Rye. Very well done, Arturo. Very fast. Okay. Next one. Jane Austen, Woman Meets Man Called Darcy Who Seems Horrible. Pride and Prejudice, 1 point to Adriana. And for the final point, this is a more modern one. Helen Fielding, Woman Meets Man Called Darcy Who Seems Horrible. He turns out to be a nice guy, really. Anybody know the answer to this one? Correct, Jenny Edwards. It's Bridget Jones's Diary. Okay. Quick just test of your English literature knowledge there. The point is that it's the same principle as the 6-word story. You could ask students to try to write it as Twitter comments. But again, it's trying to get the main sense and to summarize the idea. It's a fun way to introduce summary skills, which students can find quite hard. It can sometimes be quite dull to do. And so this is a kind of nice way into the topic and get students thinking about, how do I actually summarize things? Okay. Try it out with your students. You could do this activity just as a 15-minute part of your lesson, just to kind of get them warmed up if you want, as a sort of a lead into a lesson. There's different ways of using it. You could get them to write their own 6-word stories, or they could also kind of practice summarizing as well. So it's kind of, you could do it with movies, Anna. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You could summarize movies. I'm sure it has lots of applications, and so on. Yep, TV shows, all sorts of ways of using it. I'm sure you'll come up with all sorts of variations on it, but it's fun to do with students. Okay, next skill, discussion skills. We want students to express their own views, so they might have read something and I want them to express an opinion or have a discussion. I don't have too much to say here because I think with advanced learners, quite often they have quite a lot to say, and quite often their cognitive level is such that you can take in quite complex texts and they'll talk about them and they'll have ideas about them. I think there are 2 ways in which we can help them. One is with the type of language that they use. Now, typically, This is from the Life course books, but we teach students expressions in the books, and at Life pre-intermediate level we would introduce the following language for discussing opinions. So what do you think? What's your opinion? I think we should, in my opinion. I agree, good idea. That kind of language, yeah? The thing is with advanced learners, when they have discussions in class, quite often they use the same type of language, the same functional language, as someone's just said. But what they don't do is push the level of that language up. They stay with the phrases they're comfortable with, those pre-intermediate phrases, because they work. Victor said it. They tend to always use the same words, exactly. That's interesting, Anthony. Italians often do start sentences with "for me." Yes, it's true. With advanced learners, the list over here is also teaching them the language for discussions, but it's from Life Advanced, and you'll see the difference in the language there. We start to teach students how to propose a point or a viewpoint, but it's more tentative language. And they're also taught how to concede points, because quite often students will express an opinion but won't necessarily admit that they're wrong or they've been proved wrong. So they want the language to concede a point or perhaps to save face. And so they need this higher level kind of language. It's tentative language, it's hedging language, it's discussion language with more subtlety. So I think that's what we need to work on with advanced learners. One way to do this is if you're having a class discussion, give students the list of phrases, and every time they use one of those phrases in the discussion, they give it a tick. And they try during the course of the discussion to tick all the phrases and use everything up, so they kind of get practice. So that's one key thing for the advanced students and their discussion skills. The other thing is to teach advanced learners strategies. Now, you've probably all done classroom discussions and classroom debates, and sometimes they can go really wrong. Students express their opinion and then there's no real discussion. They just stop talking. What's really useful is to set aside some time before discussion to let students plan what they're going to say. For example, if I was going to do a discussion on the topic of beauty that we were looking at earlier, I might say to the students, decide whether you're for or against the opinion. And what I want you to do using this table is write 3 main arguments to support your opinion. So students have to think about why they think that and then write their arguments. Then I say to them, think about what a person who disagrees with you, what would they say? What would be their counter-argument? And they write the counter-argument here. So what they're doing is they're thinking critically about what the other side thinks. It's all about empathizing and understanding and seeing other people's perspective. It's a bit like a chess game, Anna, yeah. And then once they've done their counter-arguments, they think of their replies so that they've already planned how they're going to have the discussion. If they spend about 10 minutes before the discussion filling in this kind of table, the quality of this discussion is so much better. They could do it as pair work. They could plan the things, plan it together, and then prepare for the debate. But it will just improve the debate. Yes, Simon, it's sort of flipping it, isn't it? It's asking them to do that pre-work, and then when they come to class to communicate and discuss, the quality is so much better. You could set it for homework, yeah, but you're teaching them a strategy. I mean, I teach this strategy even to students whose first language is English, if they're university students, because it's better quality discussion that I get afterwards. So it's a useful task. So those were 2 tips on discussion skills. Let's get on to where time is running away with us. Research skills. I want students to go home, do homework, and maybe research more on a topic. Maybe I want them to prepare a presentation, or I want them to do some research to write an essay, those kinds of skills. One of the problems that students have nowadays is knowing where to go to do the research. What is a good place to do the research? Now, students have access to the internet, but the problem is, what is the quality of the information on the internet? So before you do research with students, the next 2 exercises are very useful. This one, somebody's just mentioned sources. Bianca's mentioned sources. I might ask them to do this exercise where I give them a list of sources they might use to do research, just to give them ideas on where to do research, but then I'll also get them to think about whether it's a reliable source or not. And they write 1 if it's not reliable, 2 if it might be reliable, or 3 if it's usually reliable. So let's try this. If I said to the students, a shared post on social media, would you give it a score of 1, 2, or 3? Just type in the chat box. 1, maybe lots of 1s, maybe 2s. It kind of depends, doesn't it? But they'd certainly have to go and check that the information was good information. They couldn't just trust social media. What if I said the source was an article in a newspaper? What score would you give it then? 2s? 1s? The question that students usually start asking is, well, it depends on the newspaper, which is obviously a good answer. Yeah, somebody's just written, depends on the reputation of the newspaper. That's actually the question, because it's sort of, there are some newspapers it might be typically very reliable and others that aren't. But that's good, useful classroom discussion. It means that students have to think about the quality of the source. So that's one activity to get advanced students thinking about how they're going to do the research and where they're going to look for it. The other one is that students will use the internet a lot, and for this they need information literacy skills, or they need digital literacy skills, but really it's information literacy. And what I do sometimes is give students a little awareness raising quiz, and I'm going to show you part of the quiz that I give them. So this is my information literacy quiz. Now there's 3 questions, and each question has an ABC answer, and I thought we'd do this for a bit of fun, just to test your information literacy. So Emily's going to put the poll question in front of you, and you're going to answer the question, and we'll see what you think. So you want to include 2 sentences from an online article in your essay for homework, which is allowed. Can you choose one of the answers? Let's see what you all decide. This one's a pretty easy one, but for your students, they may never have thought about it before. And most of you are going for answer B, which, yes, that is the answer that I would give, that you can use sentences with quotation marks and quote the source. It's really important that they're aware of that. As Jasmine's just said, plagiarism is illegal. Okay. Question 2. The poll is coming up from Emily, I think. It's looking slightly... Oh, there we go, Emily. You find a photo online that you would like to reuse on a school project. Which of the following is it okay to do? Let's see which you think for this. And the majority of you are going for the last one. Yeah. Normally, if the photo has CC license, that tells you whether you're okay to use it because it refers to the copyright. Question 3 is a bit more open, so let's put question 3, and your opinions might be more different with this one. You made a short video and posted it online. A year later you find your video is reposted on someone else's blog, but it doesn't mention your name. How do you feel about it? Oh, there's some angry people amongst you. So the answers are slightly more split here. So now we've got the majority of you are a bit annoyed, but that's what happens on the internet. So you just all accept that this is okay on the internet. I think that I would be really angry and probably write to the blogger to complain about it, to be honest. But it depends on the video and how I feel about it. The point is, with that exercise, it's just it's a nice vocabulary exercise because it contains a lot of interesting vocabulary for students. But it's also raising their awareness of information literacy in terms of doing research on the internet. And you can create more questions. And in fact, I have a book coming out next year called Critical Thinking in ELT that I wrote with Paul Dummett. It'll be available next year, and the full quiz is in that book, plus some other ideas on research skills for students. Okay, so but you'll hear more about that if you're interested at the beginning of next year. But it's a useful task to give students before doing their research, particularly because students will go to the internet. Okay, we've nearly finished. We've got a few minutes. Critical reflection skills, very quickly. Teachers give feedback. We tell students what they were successful. If the students have written an essay, I tell them what I liked about the essay, what they need to work on, and so on. But with advanced learners, I want to develop autonomous learners who can reflect on the quality of their own work as part of the writing process. Or if they're preparing a presentation, I want them to reflect on the quality of the presentation and then decide what action they're going to take next. Very quickly, a simple way of doing this is if, for example, if you ask students to write an essay, I would typically then ask the students to swap the essays over and use this checklist to evaluate each other's work. This particular checklist is aimed at getting them to focus on the structure of a for and against essay and to check that it contains evidence and so on. So you just design the form according to whatever it is they're writing. Or you could design the form for presentation skills. If students was giving a presentation, they could also do it. Yeah, Jessica's done it with academic writing. It's not a new activity, and we use it quite a lot in the life books on the writing pages where students give peer feedback. But you can also, with the critical of reflection, you can also add a new layer where you give the students a blank checklist, and as a class they define what they think makes a good essay. So you discuss it as a class and they write in what they think makes a good essay, and then they use those criteria to analyze their essays after they've written the essays. Now this does a number of things. It means that students think very deeply about what makes a good essay. They then think very deeply about their own writing while they're writing because they know what they're being assessed for because they defined it. And then afterwards they use it to assess each other. And that's what I mean by critical reflection in a sense. It's quite a simple approach, but it really develops those critical reflection skills. And you need to set aside time. It takes time to do it with the students, but it's, as you say, Bianca, it's really motivating, and it's a way of raising the quality of their work, I think, in the long term. So I would really recommend it. Which brings me to the end. We've looked at the advanced learner, and I've said the key critical thinking skills for me, there are others: questioning, summarizing, discussion, research, critical reflections. Okay? And there are other critical thinking skills, but I think with advanced students, those are particularly the key ones. Okay. Pauline has asked about writing books. I know that National Geographic has a book on writing. I can't remember the exact title. Also, the Life books have big writing section, and we also have additional writing exercises as well. If you go to the Life website, you'll find additional ideas for writing as well. Okay. Thank you all for attending. Do we have any? We've got 4 minutes left. Any kind of quick questions or comments from anybody? I've given you a lot of information very quickly, so I know you had a lot to take on. Thank you all for attending. I hope it was useful and worth staying up till 1 o'clock in the morning for some of you. Okay. All right. Emily, I think we're going to stop there. Everybody seems happy enough and ready to go to bed. So perhaps you can take over. Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, John. It was really a great webinar. And like John said, thank you all of you who have stayed up, or if it's early in the morning, thank you for coming on. We're so glad you could join us here today, and we really hope it was useful for your teaching practice. Just a few last-minute notes before we wrap up here. Several of the examples John used today were from Life 2nd edition, as he mentioned. For more information on that, I can put the link in the chat box right here. But it's a 6-level series, and these are the British English covers that you see on the slides right now. They're really beautiful. So I'm going to put that right there. To check out more and to download samples, you can definitely check it out there. And also, we'd love for you to join us again at another webinar. We do have one next week, and that's actually with the co-author of Life, Paul Dummett, and that will be more geared towards young learners. But you can register on the website link right on, just get the arrow here so you can see right here. And then we'd love for you to follow our blog too. John is a frequent contributor to the blog, so definitely be sure to check out his posts there. It's eltngl.com/infocus. And we'd love for you to be part of our online social community too for teachers of English. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to send you all now to a short survey. Oh yes, and the certificate. I'm so sorry I didn't mention that. We'll be sending that within 5 days following this webinar, so just stay tuned for that. You'll also get the slides and the recording as well. And the recording and slides are always posted on our webinar website, so you can find them there too. I'm glad you enjoyed the webinar, Andrea. That's great. Hope you all did. I'm going to send you all to a quick survey now to get your feedback so we can help keep bringing you helpful webinars in the future. All right, bye everyone. Have a good night.